And now it's time for conclusions. If we were all together, there might be treats in the class. So please, if you want to pause this and go get some granola bars or something, feel free. But yes, it's our last lecture. We're going to talk a little bit about new directions post-2000, verbatim theater and London Road, Hamilton, Fun Home, Hadestown, what's next, and some ending thoughts. So this is just a brief sketch of a few post-2000 musicals that are interesting and that kind of do different things that are worth studying and finding out more about. One is Come From Away, which is the story of a small Canadian town that ended up being the place where a lot of transatlantic flights did emergency landings on September 11th, 2001, after all the, flights shut down. It's a Canadian written musical with, like local songs, ensemble cast, minimalist sets, folk music. It's a great kind of way to tell a tragic story, with some kind of distance, because it might be almost too much to have to see it in person. So I definitely recommend that. A lot of people like Book of Mormon, and it's good for representation. I mean, a lot of times when, LDS folks are depicted in popular culture, it's fundamentalists, it's, the fascination our culture has with plural marriage, all that kind of stuff. And this is sort of more like, I guess, mainstream LDS missionaries. So that's good. But I think as I was watching it, as soon as it became about a missionary trip to Uganda, and it became very uncomfortable, and, as nicely as you can represent the Black Africans in your show, and they've made changes to make it better, which means it wasn't so great to begin with, it's still about kind of colonialism and should probably get a little bit more critical treatment than that. And also Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson. I knew someone who was involved with that, and it was a clever and creative way to kind of, make an older historical figure, kind of a rock star. This is well before Hamilton. But Jackson was also an awful racist guy, and it's kind of a misreading. With Hamilton, I think one of the things that worked about it, and that's why it's good to talk about a show that didn't work, and Hamilton kind of indirectly learned from that. With Hamilton, the worst characters stayed in character, even though their lines were modern. Like, you don't really forget who they are. When you move someone into, 2022 era US, it ends up needing a lot more caveats and filters, I guess. So yeah, these are all interesting. Give them a little bit of a shot here and see what you think. We're going to talk a little bit about one new trend in theater, and that's verbatim theater. And Alecki Blythe tends to be a go-to person for this stuff. She wrote a show called London Road a few years ago, which is about some similar content to Sweeney Todd and Threepenny Opera and some of these other sort of violent urban landscapes, right down to, the presence of sex workers everywhere. And it's about a murderer. He terrorizes a neighborhood near London. It's during the holiday season, even close to Christmas. But the way it ends up looking on screen, Blythe uses found footage and documents as the book or libretto for a show. So she's basically doing historical research and picking up the speech patterns of these different people testifying. And so it turns out more like a documentary style musical. There are actors playing the parts, so it's not exactly, it's not exactly a documentary, and of the people in London Road, I think, is it Tom Holland in it? Olivia Colman is in it as well. So these clips here, we've got a couple of clips from the film. We've got Blythe talking about her process and how she works, which I think is fascinating. And then she's got a new work that's seriously from 2022. It played in London. I haven't obviously seen it, but it's called Our Generation, and it sounds fantastic. So definitely take a look at that for an example of how her non-musical verbatim work goes. All right, the biggest play of the 21st century thus far, Hamilton. Now that you are at this point in this class, however, you can see a lot more of what makes Hamilton unique, and you can see more of what ties it to other shows. It's multi-influenced. You see hip-hop, Broadway, jazz, girl groups, etc., etc. When it was first performed, it felt completely unique compared to everything else that was out there. It was nearly impossible to secure tickets, and, it helped make Miranda's career. He'd already done In the Heights, so it's not like he didn't have, credibility. But Hamilton was stratospheric, really, at the time it came out. Daveed Diggs, Philippa Sue, Leslie Odom Jr., Christopher Jackson. It's just a phenomenal cast. Almost entirely non-white cast in a largely white space. I mean, Broadway was not very integrated. It still isn't that integrated. It's received criticism kind of after the initial excitement for downplaying slavery, for its choice of subject. Is this show glorifying an enslaver who basically launched American capitalism? At the same time, it's clever, it's catchy. The acting is fantastic. The lyrics are nuanced. It's breaking down some boundaries so that more entertainment that is new can come to Broadway, and people will be willing to invest in it. New York is expensive. Those theaters are expensive. People looking to put a new show on really do care about what you can charge for tickets and how many butts you'll get in seats. Lin-Manuel Miranda's really one of the first people to, legitimately be compared to Stephen Sondheim. It's different work, but at the same time, being able to work with language in this way is very difficult. So it's a very small club, certainly. If you're not that familiar with it, please watch it. Please watch these clips. And think about Hamilton in light of the rest of the class. Fun Home, in terms of queer subjects, does some interesting work. It's based on Alison Bechdel's graphic novel, growing up in a family-run funeral home. That's the Fun Home. And the narrator is, also named Allison, not surprisingly, and her coming out intersects with her father's struggles with his own closetedness and his own sexuality. And there's this sort of parallel narrative of his self-destruction as, perhaps partly being from an older generation, while the narrator is learning to love and embrace herself. So there is hope, but it's a bittersweet kind of hope. These interior struggles are really hard to make into a show, and I think it did an excellent job of that. I think part of that is because of the graphic novel. We can see things as they happen. You already have visuals and words to start with, which is very different from a novel, which gives you more interiority to start with. There are, surprisingly, for a very queer space, major Broadway musicals about queer subjects aren't that common. But I think one of the things that helped it work is that Circle in the Square is a smallish theater. That's where it showed. It's a theater in the round. I actually saw it here or there at Circle in the Square, and it has, there's seating all the way around it, like when you go to a basketball game or something. And the way it's staged uses that setting to give us a full view at all times. It's really interesting. Definitely think about, the connection between a theater and the way you end up staging the play. And finally, I had to do this as the last one because Hadestown gives us Orpheus and Eurydice in a contemporary integrated adaptation. Um, when we talked about the very, very first operas and Orpheus as the subject of quite a large number of them, I was very excited that Hadestown was out and that we could close the circle like this. There are things about these stories that still attract people after centuries. I think I mentioned in an earlier clip that the film Portrait of a Lady on Fire also cites Orpheus as an important narrative. So think about what it is about that love that almost worked, but tragedy intervenes just because you want to look back at this person you love so much. So yeah, make sure you watch and listen. So what are we thinking is going to happen next? Well, I'm looking at actual shows in pre-production here. And thinking about what's been successful in the past often predicts what will be funded next, not just what's written, but what are people going to pay to put on. Remember, Tick, Tick, Boom, the musical that Larson was trying to sell in that musical didn't work. I think we're going to see more queer subjects, more historical figures, contemporary music, current shows in pre-production. There's an adaptation of the book The Kite Runner. There is what is probably going to be a jukebox musical, Almost Famous. The film was, used a lot of 60s and 70s songs to tell its story, so I'm guessing that's going to come back there. Leopoldstadt is a multi-generational family story from Vienna during the World War II era. World War II is always really popular. I mean, if we have, if it has something like what Cabaret had in terms of statements about fascism, I can see that becoming very popular. It will not surprise you that somebody's bringing back 1776. I mean, there's, Hamilton is there. Why not have make a weekend of it? By far, the one I would want tickets for the most here is K-pop, the musical. So I'm looking forward to that very much. I think that's just a fantastic subject for a musical. And again, more integration in Broadway is a great thing to see. And then Some Like It Hot, where you have the Billy Wilder film, an adaptation, a remake, that's also about the jazz age and about a jazz band and has cross-dressing in it. So there's a lot to work with there. So here we are at the end of our journey. Where have we been and what have we learned? So you've learned a lot about the history of the musical as a rich one with a lot of potential. It still hasn't fully reflected our diverse culture and our history. I'm interested in seeing how that changes over the years. Musicals have tremendous cultural power and reach. Some of the most incredible performances are in these shows. The ceiling for accomplishment is exponentially high. The possible difficulty, possible artistry in multiple areas, it's tough to comprehend. I mean, in some ways, it's like a sport like figure skating, where people, at one point weren't doing more than a double axel jump, and now you see people doing triple axel jumps. People can keep doing more and doing better, and people will keep buying tickets to see it. Some musicals offer better social criticism of culture than other media. For example, when we watched the Stein and Sondheim show, women are commodified at every age, and there's this sense that you're spat out when you're no longer useful, which is something you see a lot of in entertainment. But even in spite of some of those sadder lessons, theater is always there. It's there for escape, for joy, and for catharsis. Thank you, everybody.